Hello and welcome everyone. My name is Mark Henry, and today we're going to talk about NMIS setup and configuration for NMIS 8.6.3G. A few little housekeeping pieces here as we get started. So everyone's going to be put on mute to begin with. That just cuts down background noise, anyone talking, etc. during the presentation. If you have a question, please use the GoToWebinar's chat feature. We keep an eye on chat while we're doing the presentation. It's just me here, so I'll respond to any questions that you post in. If you want to use GoToWebinar's question system, you're welcome to use that as well. We are going to have a Q&A session at the end of the webinar. So if you'd rather not use the chat window, if you want to wait and ask something with your microphone or chat, that's fine. So we've set aside time at the end of the webinar. And what we'll do at the end is, once we get done the presentation, which includes a series of PowerPoint slides and actual demonstrations of NMIS, what we'll do is we'll turn off the recording. So we are recording this session, so we can make it available to any attendees who want to come back and review it again. But we'll turn off the recording at the end of the presentation. That way, if you're a little shy, you don't want to ask your questions on the recording, that's fine. We'll turn off the recording and you can ask your questions at that point. So today's topics, we're going to be covering what's latest, what's new in the NMIS 8.6.3G release, G standing for Gold Edition. So we'll talk about the latest features and functionality in 8.6.3. We're going to talk about prerequisites for spinning up NMIS in your own environment. So we'll talk about things from operating systems to server and hardware requirements. We're even going to talk about manpower requirements. So how many people do you need to actually implement, maintain over time, and then operate your NMIS performance and fault monitoring system. We'll then go into NMIS setup. So how do you set up the server or the system once it's installed? And then we'll talk about NMIS configuration, and we'll talk a bit about why we separate those two concepts, setup from configuration. We'll talk about that in a little bit of detail and what drives the differences in those pieces. All right, so to start off with, we have some useful references. So for everyone on the webinar now, you can actually download a copy of this PowerPoint. It's in the handouts pane in your GoToWebinar system. If you're viewing this on Opmantek's website, there should be a download link on the blog for this video to allow you to download this as a PDF, so you can get all of these links live. Just copy them and paste them. So we have a link here to the Opmantek wiki for the NMIS product homepage. If you have questions regarding NMIS or any of Opmantek's products, how-tos, how do you configure something, how do you run it, if you've run into a problem, etc. If you don't have a support and maintenance contract with us for NMIS, you can ask those questions on the community questions board. Either an Opmantek staff member or one of the community members will get back to you as quickly as possible. If you do have a support and maintenance contract with Opmantek, please remember to email support@opmantek.com, and we'll get back to you within your SLA period for your contract. If you have any questions about purchasing a support and maintenance contract for NMIS or licensing any of Opmantek's commercial products, feel free to email us at usa@opmantek.com. If you're located out of North America, so the US and Canada region, if you're located out of that area, the US sales team will be happy to do an introduction to your local regional sales group. So what's new in the latest version of NMIS 8.6.3G? Before I dive into that, let me just give you a little bit of kind of a social background on where NMIS came from and where it's heading to. So NMIS version 1 was first released into open source in 1999. The lead architect on that first release was Keith Sinclair. Keith is Opmantek's CTO and lead architect for the NMIS product line, as well as the product manager for NMIS and all of the commercial modules that plug into it. So NMIS was released into open source. Over the next several years, the product morphed and grew just organically through users providing feedback, providing code samples, writing new interfaces, new screens, submitting models for the tool. In late 2009, early 2010, Keith was approached by several high-end NMIS users, people who had used NMIS to grow managed service providers and different types of consulting practices around the product, who talked to him about forming a business around the concept of providing support and maintenance for NMIS. And that was the birth of Opmantek. So Opmantek's headquarters at the time was in Brisbane, Australia, where Keith was located, and where several of the initial founders were as well. Opmantek continued to grow over the next several years. Some very high-profile Fortune 50 companies bought into support and maintenance for NMIS very early on. Others also helped fund the development of commercial modules. So while NMIS remains free and open source, you can download it today, costs you absolutely nothing, spin it up in your atmosphere, and be up and running in 15 or 20 minutes doing performance and fault management at your organization. There was the understanding that for large size businesses, for enterprise class businesses, and even for telcos and managed service providers, there was the need for additional functionality above and beyond what could be done through the open source kind of development network. And so Opmantek started developing commercial modules that are commercially licensed and plug in seamlessly with NMIS. So that gets us to where we are today. NMIS is currently in use by more than 80,000 businesses worldwide. That's right, I said 80,000 businesses worldwide, and they're managing about, as far as we can tell, somewhere around $6 to $7 billion worth of equipment. So let's talk about what's new in the 8.6.3G release. And what I'm going to do here is I'm actually going to switch back and forth between the PowerPoint presentation and a little demo server that we have spun up that we use for live client demonstrations. So let's talk about the concept of variable frequency polling. So prior to 8.6.3, you would set through a cron entry, through a cron job, your polling frequency. How often do you want to collect SNMP performance data from devices on a regular schedule? And that was kind of a global setting. So in most cases, our system ships preset for 5 minutes. And so it would do collections across all of your devices on the server every 5 minutes. One of the things that we realized as operational engineers, and also from feedback from the client base, was that there are, while that worked for the bulk of devices, maybe 80% of all devices, that there were a group of devices that probably don't need to be polled that often. Maybe they don't change often. Maybe they only need to be collected every 30 minutes or every hour. And then there were also an other small subset of devices that might benefit from being collected on as fast as every minute. So with the new variable frequency polling, you can actually define your own polling schedules. So let's take a quick look over here. And I'm just going to, I've opened up NMIS 8.6.3. This is the default dashboard. This is going to all be changed. And I'm going to come up and I'm going to come down to polling policy. So in the polling policy, and let me just zoom in. There we go. With the polling policy, you're able to define different polling intervals. And so it talks about ICMP ping frequency, SNMP polling frequency, WMI polling frequency. And so you can define these separately. 8.6.3 ships with 3 different polling frequencies, fast polling, half hourly, and very infrequently. So different options for you here. We also have the standard stock 5 minute across the line. So it's 5 minute, 5 minute, 5 minute straight across. That is kind of the default. And then you assign a polling policy per device. So in each device's details window, you can actually select and pick and assign a polling policy for that device from any ones that you have that you've defined here. We've added some additional capabilities to the scheduled outage system in NMIS. We've added the ability to add some really flexible candidate and period selectors. So the idea that you, rather than just selecting an individual device, you might select all devices at a specific location. You might select all devices in a group. You might select all devices assigned to a specific customer, all devices assigned to it or that have a specific business service assigned to it. And you might select larger periods. So you could do every Monday from 9 to noon, every other Saturday afternoon, the first Saturday of the month, the second Thursday of the month, etc. So we've added a lot of flexibility here. Now you'll notice when you open up the recurring outage window in NMIS, that there's a slight change in the format here, but it still only allows you to select nodes or nodes. So in NMIS, there's no GUI for selecting some of the wider options. But if you look down towards the bottom of this panel, and this is all documented on our wiki, you can see examples of using groups, using business services to define the outages as well, and then how often those types of things happen. So you can do it directly by editing the file by hand, or if you license OP Charts has a complete GUI setup for selecting devices by any of the metadata tags, like location or business service, customer, etc., and then creating very complex schedules as well. In addition, we've added a tremendous amount of input data validation. There is no GUI to access the data validation system. A lot of NMIS's customizations are actually done at the command line by editing configuration files. The example here is to look at the table-nodes file, which defines all the different fields that show up in a device's details window, and determines the validation rules determine which fields can be blank and which ones have to be filled out. So you'll want to definitely take a look at the our web page on data validation. The great thing with that is that if you have very specific requirements at your organization, you want to help do a little bit of data scrubbing as people are adding devices, or let's say creating new customers, adding in new users, etc. You can add in or manipulate the data validation around those all those fields, and you can do it on a field by field basis. So it's very flexible. An important addition over the last couple of releases of NMIS, I think it came out in 8.6.0, if not 8.6.2, was the addition of audit logging and the new audit.log file. So the concept here, of course, is just what the name suggests. As users log into NMIS and they make changes to the system, if they go through the GUI and they edit, let's say, configuration items, polling policies, etc., those types of things are captured. Those changes are captured. They're attributed to the logged in user, whoever was logged in, whatever account was logged in. And those things are stored in audit.log. And of course, audit.log is under whatever log rotation policy you have in place as well. So that information is stored, it's logged. You can certainly grab those rotated logs and store them, move them over to a backup drive or a NAS box or something, using a simple cron job and a script. The point here, of course, is that, and we heard this from several directions, right? We heard it from NOC managers saying, someone's reconfigured NMIS and they've bodged the whole system up, and we want to know who it is. And then we've also heard it from the other direction as well, is that auditors would come in and say, well, who changed these policies, right? How do you know who changed these policies? How do you know that they were authorized to? And how can you line those things up? So we came at it from a couple different directions. We're building out the audit logging capability all the time. We're adding more things that are being logged. We're also adjusting the granularity as we get feedback from people. So if you download NMIS 8.6.3 and you're interested in that, take a look at audit.log. Let us know what you think about that information, and we can always look to adjusting that and adding more information over time. One item that we've found has gotten a lot of really positive review is the idea of adding a configurable context link to a device details. So let's take a look at that. And I'm just going to use the quick search window over on the left-hand side to open up Asgard's device details. So here's Asgard. Asgard's just a little Cisco router. So a couple of cool new additions that you might notice. There's an outage status. So the outage hello world is current for this device. Up here in the top header, you'll see where it says node in OP charts. That's actually a link. That's a contextual link. It's been set in the edit node. So if I go to the node details, I'm going to click edit node. And if we scroll down, you'll see right about halfway down the context node. So you have the name node in OP charts. That's what is appearing in that header at the top of the screen, up here in the top. Sorry, the circle doesn't move when the screen scrolls. And then we've provided a contextual URL. And that URL doesn't necessarily have to be on the same server, right? So you could point it to another server. You could send it to perhaps your internal wiki. You could send it to your help desk system. You could send it to, you could send it to Google if you wanted to, right? So you could really use that for a lot of different opportunities for updating and maintaining the node. But just to give you an idea here, and again, this links out to one of our commercial products, OP Charts, which is a kind of an enterprise level dashboarding solution. It allows you to create really, really rich, interactive single panes of glass that tie in event management, configuration, compliance management with device information. So this is what Asgard looks like in OP Charts, and we can drill into different types of performance graphs. And whether that link opens a new tab or opens in the same tab, that's configurable. You can do a lot of changes with that, a lot of different ways you can deal with it. And then, of course, the user's own browser settings can override some of those pieces as well. All right, so back to NMIS again. So we talked about configurable context links. The next piece here is the idea that NMIS now supports single sign-on for all of Opmantek's applications. So previous to 863, you could do single sign-on from one instance of NMIS to another. So if you had multiple NMIS servers, perhaps they're covering different subnets, different geographic areas, you could actually create a cookie. So you could create a single sign-on, log into one NMIS server, and then when you opened an other, as long as that first browsing session was still open, it would reuse the cookie from that first session and log you into NMIS. But what it didn't do is it didn't allow you to log into things like OP charts, OP events, OP reports, any of the commercial modules. Those all had a separate cookie system. So now it's set up through the NMIS setup. You can either choose to keep it separate as it originally shipped, or to share the same cookie that's used throughout the commercial modules. So again, the whole idea is to try to make the user experience as fluid as possible. And if you do need to deploy multiple NMIS servers, say you're scaling horizontally and vertically using Opmantek's OPHA, high availability solution, to connect servers together, that you can move in between those servers seamlessly. One last example, a new feature from 863 that I really want to point out. This one I am very, very excited about myself. So in the past, if NMIS was polling a device, so it was pinging it, it was doing SNMP queries on it, and if for some reason, if you added a device to the system and it never polled successfully, it would be marked as SNMP would be down, because it might not be responding to SNMP. And if for whatever reason, maybe you mistyped the IP address, or your network rules, your network security, et cetera, doesn't allow your NMIS polling to get to the device or the return to come back, or doesn't allow pinging, then it would be marked as node down. And that could be aggravating, because in many cases we were hearing from customers and they'd say, look, we're getting ready to roll out a whole new office, and I've added in the 100 devices for the office, and it keeps generating alerts and events because it can't talk to those devices, and it won't be able to talk to those for another few weeks. What can I do here? So, originally we told them, well, go through and turn all these devices active equals false, and then you can turn them back on when the location goes live. But that kind of manual intervention, people forget to turn things back on, right? And then devices aren't being collected on, events aren't being raised, all bedlam ensues. So instead what we did is we took a kind of a proactive automated approach. If you add a device to NMIS and it is never polled successfully, we actually demote that device's polling frequency automatically. Okay? Polling will continue to be demoted until it goes all the way down to just once a day. So NMIS will attempt to connect to that device. If it doesn't connect, if the device doesn't respond to SNMP, doesn't respond to ping, it'll log a message about the demotion, right? But that's it. It won't continue raising errors about that device. Now, if it connects to the device and the device responds, as soon as it responds, NMIS will promote that device back to regular, normal polling, right? So once a day, it hits the device finally responds, and NMIS says, okay, great, that device is now in use, and immediately starts polling that device on a normal frequency or on whatever polling schedule you've assigned to it. So we are kind of thoughtfully adding these types of automation routines. The concept that that having the system help you in your setup, in your configuration, in your monitoring, in your notifications, helps reduce your workload, helps automate and make your life easier as engineers. We love to hear from you. So if you have ideas, if you have suggestions for how we can do that, for additional ways that we can help automate NMIS to make your lives easier, email your suggestions in to support@opmantek.com. If you actually do your own coding, if you've done any coding changes at all, and you'd like to have those coding changes rolled into the code base, you can actually submit any coding changes to code, CODE, at opmantek.com as well. All right. So that covers the new features and functionality for NMIS 863G. So let's talk a bit about installation, right? Let's go into the concept of installation. So you've decided you want to download NMIS, you want to spin it up, you want to give it a try, see how it works. There's really two choices for you at this point. You can install NMIS from scratch. It installs on pretty much any Linux 64-bit system. We do have a complete breakdown of operating systems that our installer fully supports. We have had clients disassemble our installer and do installations on other operating systems, although we don't necessarily support them fully. So you can do an NMIS installation completely from scratch. The wiki link here will walk you through that whole process. The second option you have is to download the Opmantek virtual appliance. So this is a fully configured OVA. It is based on CentOS 6.9. We just released the latest version, I believe, in February of this year. So it is updated, it is patched, but of course, anytime you download any kind of a virtual machine, you should certainly patch the operating system right off. If you start with the virtual appliance, it comes sized very, very small, and that actually helps the OVA, be a good starting size. So one of the first things you want to do is, as soon as you get the OVA spun up, you'll want to resize that virtual machine, add CPU, add RAM, add additional disk space before you continue on to setup and configuration on that VM. So your choice, whichever way you want to go. If you go the direction of installing from scratch, right, you can get the NMIS installer directly from the opmantek.com website under downloads. You can of course get the virtual machine from there as well. A couple of points to just really drive home. Make sure you either disable Linux or you set it into permissible mode. You should disable IP tables, or you have to configure IP tables or any software firewall to allow HTTP, HTTPS, port 80, port 443, and then there's a couple of UDP ports there as well that you need to take care of. Those are all covered on the installation page. The NMIS installer does fully support upgrading an existing installation, and that currently goes all the way back to anyone who's running any of the versions of NMIS 4.0, right, or 4.x rather. So if you're on an older 4.x installation, which at this point would be about 6 years old, 7 years old, and you want to do an upgrade, you can absolutely upgrade. Just run our installer. The installer will reformat all of the data tables, restructure everything, and does all the installation for you. The installer does need internet access for YUM and CPAN to be able to upgrade any NMIS installation. So you'll want to make sure that's available as well. Pardon me. One note, the NMIS installer is automated and flexible. So there's a lot of different things that you can do with the installer. That's all well documented on the wiki again. So you can actually access the source code without installing it. So basically you're unpacking the installer. So you can unpack the installer if you just want to see the source files. You can also install the non-standard locations. That's all covered again. You can also run an automatic or unmonitored installation, right? So we have many clients who have set up the kind of through something like Chef or Puppet, where they'll deploy NMIS onto a server and they'll have the installer run, and then they'll actually configure it using Chef or Puppet remotely all through script, right? And so they don't want to have to stop and say yes, yes, yes to all of those kinds of prompts. You know, do you want to install your upgrade Perl, etc. So you can do a complete automatic installation with all the default settings, and you can even unpack everything and do a manual install. So cues for all of that and documentation for all of that is either on the wiki or packed inside the NMIS installer. So you can unpack everything, take a look at it. I do anywhere between 10 and 15 demonstrations of Opmantek's products every week. And one of the questions I'm often asked by managers are, how many people does it take to use your system, right? And I didn't realize how important a question that was until I talked to a client who was using a competing product, and they had 4 full-time engineers assigned just to the health, welfare, and feeding of that network monitoring solution. 4 people to run a solution for about 5,000 devices. And so we sat, we chatted about it, and I reached out to a group of high-end NMIS users who are really pushing the product, monitoring thousands, in some cases tens of thousands of devices, and asked them how they manage or how they resource their systems. And these were the kind of numbers I looked at. So for a basic system implementation, and this is on a single server deployment, you were looking at about one full-time or one part-time engineer working anywhere from 16 to 24 hours to configure an NMIS server. And this is somebody doing it for the first time, right? So anywhere from 2 to 3 days total work. Didn't have to be consecutive, didn't have to be all in one shift, right? But to take NMIS from uninstalled, read through the documentation, understand it, download it, install it, do the setup, do the configuration, add devices to it, about 16 to 24 hours to get a server up and running and configured for an individual customer's requirements. Ongoing maintenance was about 2 hours per week for each NMIS server. Now, if you only have one server, that doesn't sound like much. If you're a really large install, we have clients who have 45 and 50 NMIS servers in place, whether they're all in one data center or spread out geographically across an entire continent or multiple continents. That can end up being more time. And what their approach actually is to take a DevOps perspective. So rather than hitting each server manually, logging into the server, executing whatever commands, they approach it from a DevOps standpoint. And then that actual per server time per week drops dramatically as they start scaling out and automating a lot of their maintenance and upkeep. Of the system, in this case, the concept of a kind of a knock location, right? So not necessarily that NMIS is running in a black box and it just raises an event, I get an email and I deal with that. Obviously, that doesn't take, any dedicated resources if you're just working kind of a firefighting mode. But if you're being proactive, if you're proactively using NMIS to monitor equipment, monitor services, monitor applications, generate synthetic application transactions, see how those are doing. So if you're proactively working to improve the quality of your network experience, then a single engineer can effectively support anywhere from 8 to 12,000 devices on a shift. Right, and give that some thought. We're going to talk for a minute about how many devices an individual server can support. But if you're looking at 12,000 devices, you might be looking at 3 or 4 NMIS servers. So an individual engineer can monitor all of that information, manage all of that information because of the way the system's designed and the way the system generates alerts. NMIS server sizing. This is a topic of kind of endless discussion here at Opmantek. We talk to clients all the time. Get on the line, get on the phone, get on demo, do a demonstration. One of the first questions I hear is well, how much resources do I need? How many devices can I monitor with those resources? One of the real challenges are, quite frankly, there's no hard and fast numbers to that. It really comes down to that first bullet at the bottom of the page here. So this chart gives you kind of a little guide. If you had 2 virtual CPU, 2 gigs of RAM, 60 gigs of hard drive, and that's the small size. That's actually the size that our actual appliance ships at. About 500 devices or 2,000 elements. An element is a combination of things like a device, an interface, a service running on a server, a synthetic application, a monitor. So any of those things are kind of elements, are considered elements. And they cost resources, right? Again, NMIS is free and open source. We're really just talking about the performance of a server, how much workload a server can take. A medium implementation might be 160 gigs of hard drive space, 16 gigabytes of RAM, 8 virtual CPU. You'd get up to about 2,500 devices or about 20,000 elements. A large server would recommend at least 320 gigs. I might actually really push you more towards 500, half a terabyte, 32 gigs of RAM, 12 virtual CPU, and you'll get up to around 5,000 devices. We have some very, very large managed service providers across the globe that are simply, they configure every NMIS server at 500 gigs of storage, 32 gigs of RAM, 12 virtual CPU, and they are consistently hitting anywhere from 4,000 to 5,000 devices. More devices if they tend to be networking devices with lower interface counts that are being collected on. Few less devices if they're monitoring primarily servers and they're monitoring applications and services on those as well. A really massive implementation, 600 gigs of storage, 64 gigs of RAM, 12 virtual CPU. You'll notice the CPU doesn't change much between large and massive. In fact, it doesn't change at all. Once you get to 12 CPU, there's actually a big drop-off in performance gains by increasing more CPU. NMIS is simply just not that CPU intensive at very large deployments. It's using more memory, and hence the jump from 32 gigs to 64 gigs. And we simply say it'll handle a large number of devices. And we've had clients come back to us anywhere from 3 to about 8,500 devices on a server with 64 gigs of RAM and 12 virtual CPU. So you can really push an individual server at those sizes, even at the large and the massive size. Your biggest point of contention is not even the number of devices or the total elements that you're monitoring. It's really how fast your disk write speed is, right? So you've got to have just blindingly fast storage for really large implementations. You can't be using some kind of shared storage array that's in the next building over, any kind of latency at all. And then you're going to have difficulty getting all of your data written to the disk before the next collection cycle starts up by the system. So just some last minute kind of deployment considerations, things to kind of keep in the back of your mind as you're trying to figure out, okay, So I'm gonna spin up this NMIS server. I'm gonna monitor my network. Where do I put it? Logically, where does that thing reside? Some things to think about, right? So what are your network security restrictions? What's your architecture? How's your system set up? Where are your firewalls? How are your routers configured? You're going to have to make sure that you allow, of course, all the different types of ports and protocols for TCP and for UDP access to devices. You're going to have to enable ICMP ping monitoring. You're going to have SNMP community strings for your devices. You're going to have to enable those things for your Windows devices. You might want to have WMI enabled and have WMI user accounts for those devices so that you can collect information via WMI as well. So you're going to want to kind of look at those types of things. You're going to want to keep in mind what kind of network DMZs, right? Can you reach from outside the DMZ? Can NMIS reach through the DMZ to monitor devices inside that, like inside the PCI DSS zone? So you might spin up an NMIS server inside the PCI DSS zone to monitor devices inside that. You want to kind of keep a look on credentials. Make sure you've got all your credentials locked down. And you also want to look at things like physical limitations, right? If you're monitoring remote locations, you might want to spin up a NMIS server only in your corporate headquarters, but your connection to your remote location, do you have a dedicated circuit? Does it have high latency? You might be better off spinning up an NMIS server in that remote location. You also want to take into account air-gapped networks, right? We do an awful lot of work with the U.S. federal government, the Canadian government as well. A lot of work with their high-end contractors, McDonnell Douglas, Raytheon, Lockheed Martin. And in many cases, they'll run into situations where they're deploying solutions out to air-gapped networks. And so how does that installation without having internet access? That's actually covered in detail on our wiki as well. How do you get that done? How do you spin that up? How do you control it? How do you update it later? And then how do you get access to that information, right? How does that air-gapped network, how do notifications get out? Just kind of putting those ideas on a whiteboard and thinking them through. Very, very important. Okay, so next we're going to talk about NMIS setup. We've gone into the concepts of what's new in NMIS 863G. We talked about installing NMIS, whether it's by spinning up the Opmantek virtual appliance, the VM, or by doing a native install of NMIS. Whichever route you take, you're eventually going to get to the point where the system's up, it's running. You're able to open up that main dashboard. You're able to log in, open up that dashboard, and then where do you go from there, right? What are the next steps for you? So it's really a simple, straightforward procedure, and I'm going to repeat it several times here over the next probably 15-20 minutes of this presentation. But it's I really want to drive this concept home. About 80% of the new trouble tickets we get from people who are spinning up NMIS and adopting it as their performance and fault management solution. About 80% of those first problems we get in their first week are caused because they spun the system up and then they started pushing buttons and flipping levers and changing settings, right? Without really understanding why the defaults are the way they are. Instead, they start flipping things. Maybe they're trying to mimic a system that they retired. Maybe they're trying to mimic the way that an older system was configured at a previous employer. Whatever the cause, we really recommend get NMIS installed, get it configured, get it started, and then stick with the defaults for the first week. Add some devices to the system and then just leave the defaults alone and understand how the system works, right? Absorb all the different options that you have before you start making changes to the configurations. Get some devices in there, sort out any basic connectivity issues you have, network, firewall rules, that kind of stuff. Decide on the big metadata tags, like things like groups especially, as that's a foundational piece, but things like customers, locations, business services, all those types of additional metadata tags. You can also create your own. So you might have metadata tags for SLA. You might have metadata tags for VIP customers, etc. And then once you've got devices in there and you've got devices collecting and you see how the system works, at that point, start looking at configuration. Start thinking about, okay, now do I need to push any buttons? Now that you understand how the system actually works, how it responds, then start looking at making changes to it. So that being said, right off the bat, setup is actually now completely included on the basic setup wizard screen. So let me bring that up to you. So that'll open by default when you first open up NMIS. You can also get to it by going to Setup, Basic Setup. You'll get this nice wizard screen will pop up. So the first piece of this, the first 4 items on the screen, are really all about either dealing with naming the server. So what's the name of the NMIS server? What's the host? So what's the fully qualified domain name or IP address? And then if you want to do any kind of SSO work at all, you want to create an authentication or authentication secret, and you want to determine whether you're going to use the OMK cookie type or the NMIS cookie type. It really doesn't matter. If you're going to be using any of Opmantek's commercial modules, just leave it on OMK. If you're not, if you're dead set against it, you can leave it on NMIS. That's fine. You can change it at any time. That's fine too. The next large group of options here are going to be all about setting up emails. So it's pointing to the email server, the email port. Do you have to authenticate? Do you have to use a user and a password? Who do you want the email to come from? Some people make it, NMIS or NMIS monitoring at whatever your domain is. Your mail domains information, and then do you use TLS encryption? This last or next one down here, combined emails. This one's really interesting. I actually, it's one of the things that from a workflow standpoint, it's a key consideration. It's definitely something that needs to be talked about. But because you can flip it back and forth, it's something that you can easily test and see which is a kind of a better setting for you. But the basic concept here is that when you start generating notifications about events, so a node goes down. So NMIS does a polling cycle, finds one node that's down. If there's a notification setup, there's a contact, and there's an escalation policy in place, NMIS can generate an email, text message, pager call if someone's using pagers still. A lot of different ways to talk to people, to notify people. But do you take that individual event and create one email, right? Now let's say two devices are down. So 2 devices didn't respond. So you have an SNMP down event. You might have a node down event if they don't respond to ICMP to ping as well. So do you create individual emails for each of those? Or, because they all occurred at the same time, do you roll all of them together into a combined email that goes out to those contacts? So that's really what combined email is about. And a lot of that decision factor comes down to who's getting the email, right? So you might have a group of people that you want to notify when servers go down. You might have a different group that you want to notify when networking devices go down. And if you did combined emails, then your server guys might get notifications of network events. Your network guys might get notifications of server events. So all kinds of different things that you can do here. You just got to kind of give it a little bit of thought. The next option, which is node status mode. This comes in classic mode, coarse mode, and fine-grained mode. And there's a blue link here on this page that'll open up the page on our wiki that goes into each of these options. It is my experience and my recommendation as an engineer myself, as someone who's worked as an enterprise level engineer, but who's also owned and operated managed service providers in the past, and now who is actively training other engineers how to do good network monitoring. I really, really recommend using fine-grained mode. It'll give you a much richer user experience in the NMIS interface as far as more information about the operation and level of capability of a device. And it's frankly, it's better all around experience from a user standpoint. I have run into several end users where they say that their management team actually prefers course mode, because course mode is really up or down. It's either green go or it's red dead. The unfortunate situation is the way the course mode works is the device, if the device is on fire but it's still responding, it's still green. So performance could be shot, but as long as it's still responding to SNMP and responding to ping, it's still green. And the device actually has to pool into a little molten puddle before it turns red. So some of those things are configurable. And again, that's covered on that wiki page that's linked to by that blue link where it says on this page. Again, from my perspective, you can avoid all of that kind of questioning and how does it work and where does it go and when does it turn red by simply going to fine-grained mode. The last two options here are to create groups. Groups are, again, they're nothing but a metadata tag, but it is the primary metadata tag used by NMIS. So you'll notice that there are many screens, functions, options that are driven by groups. So you say, I want to do X to everything in this group, in Y group. So defining your groups is important. Sitting down and thinking through how you want them to be done is definitely a worthwhile exercise. It's definitely something I would want to do before I rolled NMIS out into a production environment. And it's something that I would want to have a conversation with if I was working in an environment with a lot of operators, maybe additional NMIS administrators as well. And then the last step here is to actually add nodes, add devices. So I'm going to click Add Nodes. I'm also going to close out the NMIS Setup window. So adding a device is very straightforward. There's really only 4 fields that you need in order to add a device to NMIS. And it's the ones with the little red asterisks here. Name, host name or IP address, the group you want to assign it to, and the SNMP community string that's going to be used to talk to that device. That's it. 4 key pieces. You can leave everything else blank. All the other selections on this page can be blank, and NMIS will figure out what to do with this node. Let's head back over to the PowerPoint for a minute. So we talked about setting up the NMIS host, configuring the outgoing email server. We talked about combined emails. We talked about node status, classic, coarse, or fine-grained. Again, we recommend fine-grained mode. We talked about groups. And then we talked about the concept of adding and editing devices. So once you get that basic setup wizard done, once you complete entering in your information on that, adding in your groups and adding in a small subset of devices, and I do recommend, if this is your first time spinning up NMIS, add in 5 devices, right? Add 5 devices, let NMIS start reaching out, polling them, communicating with them, collecting information. Let the charts and graphs on the NMIS dashboard start populating before you add more devices. So for example, you might see the metrics and health window. So at the top, you've got the metrics and health, and at the bottom, you have all of your groups and all of your devices. By starting with a small subset of devices, right, you can simply see how well NMIS is collecting data. So I just clicked on the name of the group. It opened up another little widget panel. I can blow this widget panel up into a new page. I can refresh this widget panel with the little icons in the top right corner. But the concept here is let NMIS communicate with that small handful of devices, 3, 5, 10, something small and manageable. Even assign them all into one group, the test group, for example. see how the system is working, right? See how it's gathering information. If statuses are coming back as degraded, drill into those devices. So for example, this first one, lab GW, is marked as a status degraded. Its health is declining. I can see that because it has a red downward facing arrow. The green upward facing arrow means that something's improving and going up. A red up arrow means that it's increasing and you don't want it increasing. So for example, that's response time. I definitely don't want response time increasing on a device. But let NMIS go. Let NMIS go for 10 minutes, 15 minutes, 30 minutes. See how it gathers information. If devices are marked as not responding to SNMP, start looking at, do you have the right SNMP community string? Can you do an SNMP walk from the NMIS server to that device, right? Does that work? So start doing some basic troubleshooting. Make sure that all of your firewall rules are in place, your network rules are in place, that ICMP, that your TCP ports, your UDP ports are open, that the NMIS server is configured properly, etc. So work those kinds of problems out on a small scale first, make it manageable, and then start adding additional groups, add more devices to the system. If you check the NMIS 8 directory, which is /usr/local/NMIS 8, there are several subdirectories in there. There are sample scripts. There are examples of configuring CSV files to import devices. So if you don't want to import devices one at a time, you can configure an Excel spreadsheet, save it out as a CSV, import it in, and get a whole handful of devices going. We've had clients do 250 devices at a time from a CSV file. You can absolutely do more than that, but NMIS has to reserve disk space, allocate database, create directory and folder structures, create files, connect to the device, gather information, create those files, and then move on to the next edition. So, anywhere from 100 to 250 really at a time is what you'd want to do at most from a CSV import. After you have your devices in the system, let it sit. Let it run for 2 days, 3 days, 4 days. Dig through the NMIS drop-downs, right? See what all the different menu options do for you. Open the different panels. Dig into the different reports, the different configuration settings. Go to the Opmantek wiki. Read up what each of those options do before you start into configuration and flipping knobs and turning dials, right? Again, the concept is we've spent a tremendous amount of time gathering user feedback over a long period of time and a lot of users. So we've got 18 years now, and there's just been a huge amount of feedback over the years. And of course, we love to hear from all of you as you start your working with NMIS and your voyage there. So let us know how it works for you. Let us know how the default settings work. If you want to make a recommendation for a change to a default setting, let us know, right? We're open to the discussion. But the system itself is tremendously flexible and configurable. And with that level of configuration, there's a lot of decisions you've got to make. And some of them affect how information is collected, how it's stored, how long it's stored, where it's stored, what information is stored. And so if you start flipping levers right away, you can often work yourself into a bad configuration because you may not fully understand the impact of a configuration change. So let the system settle out. Let it talk to your devices first. Start understanding what's available in the system and what the different configurations do before you start making changes. Once you do get to the point where the system is settled out and it's working well, some of the first things that you'll want to do is going to be to configure it to actually tell people when there are events and alerts, right? So events, alerts, outages, all of that will show up in the interface. So if you have someone sitting there monitoring the interface, setting up their own dashboards, they'll see that visually. However, it's not always the case that you can have those kinds of screens open and have someone dedicated to sitting there staring at it, right? If you're not really running a manned NOC operation, network operation center, and you have to go about your own duties, configuring new equipment, shipping it out to your locations, making configuration changes, putting out fires, responding to events, and user calling in. At some point, you're going to have to configure NMIS to generate an alert of some kind. Maybe it's an email, maybe it's a text message, maybe it's a pager, a notice to your pager. Maybe it's pushing, creating an email and pushing it into your help desk system. Any of those types of things. There's a couple of pieces that are in that. The first thing that you end up doing is you end up creating contacts. So let me close out the network metrics and health. I'm going to go back to the setup window. So many things now are in this setup menu. Contact setup. So before you can generate an email to someone, you have to make a list of the someones. So these are just two examples that are here. You'll notice that you can give the contact a name. In this case, contact 1. You can provide a duty time, right? So it's hours. It's a 24-hour clock. It goes in 1-hour increments. So you can do in this case, this has to be a 24. This person's on call 24 hours a day, Monday through Sunday, right? So you can create a duty window. So you might create a contact for Monday through Friday, 8 a.m. to 5 p.m. Then you might have an after-hours contact that handles, Monday through Friday, 5 p.m. to 8 a.m., and then also Saturday and Sunday 24/7. So you can control that. You can also control what level of alarm that individual is going to be notified on. So NMIS comes with 6 levels predefined, 5 if you don't include normal. And each of those levels can have different alarms. So for example, you might set off a warning when you smell smoke. You might set off a minor alarm when you see smoke. You might set off a major alarm when you see fire, a critical alarm when the smoke alarm is going off, and the house engulfed in flames, and a fatal is you've come home and the house is flattened and there's nothing left there. You provide an email for that individual. What's their location? You can actually tie that into the location tables. Do they have a mobile phone number? And it will take international numbers. Just add the plus sign in front of it. Pager number and alternate or desktop phone. The mobile number field is important if you're doing anything with SMS text messaging. The pager number, obviously, if you're using pagers at all. And you can create as many different contacts as you want. So once you create your contacts, then you can actually create the notifications and escalation rules that tell them when something's happened, right? So that's emails, notifications, and escalations. Back over to NMIS again. Setup, emails, notifications, and escalations. Now these two things work together. So you'll see that you can create escalations for many, many different rules of things being broken, right? So for example, this first one uses a couple key fields. So it uses, in this case, the group metadata tag says for any group. So the word default, you could read that as any or all. For any group with any role of any of a type generic. For any event, email contact 1 when the event happens, that's time 0. Email contact 2 at escalation level 1. Email contact 3 and email contact 4 on level 4. And then should they get an email when the device goes back to normal mode? So a lot of choices there. Another example would be, for example, group O number 12. So for any device in group number 12 with a role of access, a type of router. So it has to be, the metadata tag role has to be set to access. The type of device has to be set to router, and NMIS will set that itself. Then you would create in this case, you'd create an email at level 0, a second email at level 1, and then you would contact 3, contact 4, and email contact 1 here at level 3. There's several different formats and different ways that are allowable. Again, This is all covered in the wiki in a great amount of detail. The last one here, again, for example, for any device in group 12, which has a role of core, a type of router, and the event is alert fan status. So you can absolutely have different rules for any of these kinds of events happening in different groups, happening in different locations, based on event. You can even get all the way down, and there doesn't happen to be an example here, but you can do an event for a specific device. So you don't have to just do it on groups of devices. You can say, for this one device, I want to notify these people. Elements, event elements. So you can actually use event element to define things like interfaces. So you can say, for this interface on this device, I want to do something specific. Or you could say for an interface named, for example, Ethernet 0, so ETH 0 or ETH 1. So you could say for a specific interface on any device in any group, do a specific escalation rule. We have multiple escalation levels. There are actually 10 escalation levels. They start at level 0. Those are actually defined in the escalation policy. So you can actually define what time levels those are. So for example, level 0 would be time 0 when the event occurred. Level 1 is generally 5 minutes later. Level 2 might be at time 10, 10 minutes into the event. Level 3 might be 30 minutes. Level 4 might be an hour, etc. Those all come pre-configured. So you go from level 0 to level 10. Level 10 would be a 24-hour period. And escalations will continue to go until either the event clears or someone acknowledges the event in NMIS. So once the event is NMIS, the escalations stop. If the event clears, if you have the up event for that event, then the event clears and the escalations stop. All right. One last thing, we're going to talk about the node customization in the node and interface customization panel. I realize we're running a little long on today's session. I apologize for that. Feel free to stay around if you can. We're going to continue. We've got just 2 more slides of content. Again, the entire broadcast will be available to you to view online or download if you'd prefer. So one of the last things we're going to touch on is the ability to modify your node settings. So that's node customization. So with this, you can actually override information that comes back from the device. So for example, if I look at this little Cisco iOS router, I'll get back the original value. So you'll see a column here for original value. And it's just saying default under contact, default under location. So I can actually change these and I can store it. Now, I'm not actually making a change on the device itself. I'm making a change inside NMIS's database. So NMIS is going to pull information from that device. Whatever it pulls back from the device, I'm simply overriding that information. Here, for example, is a description, generate a change. I can change things like the display name. These are all specific interfaces, so I can actually change the description of an interface. I can change the display name of the interface, the speed in and out. And again, I'm not affecting the device itself. I'm not changing the device. I'm changing the information that is inside NMIS's database about that device. So a few bonus extras for everyone. If you're looking for help, if you need help troubleshooting device collection, if you're having trouble gathering information, there's a couple built-in reports in NMIS. Those are all under reports, current, and I would look at collect update time and response time. So this will give you response time. Will tell you what your ICMP ping polling time is. This will give you your collection time. So whenever you're collecting SNMP data, WMI data, it'll give you a collection time. And I've just sorted this by collect time. Update time, NMIS updates once a day, where it pulls additional fields from each device that are generally static. So that generally happens is all controlled by a cron job. That generally happens at midnight each day. So for example, you can see that these 4 devices are not being collected at all. They've not been collected for some time. I would want to look into those devices, understand what's happening, why these devices aren't being collected, what's happening with those pieces. You'll also want to look at response time. Again, that's the ICMP ping time on those devices. How responsive are they? You may also want to look at, for specific devices, are there any open events? Is it SNMP down? Is it responding to ping? You may also want to look at what NMIS model is assigned to it. So NMIS has abstracted, or Opmantek has abstracted the way that we talk to devices. It's broken all the way down to the device manufacturer, the model of the device, and even all the way down to the operating system running on specific devices. And we do that so that we can pull back the most relevant information from every single type of device there is. So if you're not getting good information, you'll want to take a look and see what model is assigned to the device, and that's all defined under the device itself. So if we take a look at the device here, you'll see, for example, that it's classified as a router, and it's running the Cisco router model. So taking a look at that, and at the product description, I know that there's no better model available for this branded device, and that information is all covered in our documentation as well. All right, ladies and gentlemen, that completes the presentation for today. I'm going to turn off recording now. We can open the floor for anyone who has any questions.